Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the Washington Brief for August 2nd, 2022. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael Jenkins, president of the Washington Times Foundation, which sponsors the Washington Brief webcast. He is also chairman of the Washington Times Holdings, the LLC that owns the Times News organization. He has led a number of well-received fact-finding trips to Korea and Japan that have met with the legislative, executive, intel, and military leadership of those countries. As president of the nonprofit NGO, the Universal Peace Federation International, Dr. Jenkins has decades-long experience conducting peace initiatives all over the world, particularly in the Indo-Pacific and the Middle East. Dr. Jenkins, welcome.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you for all you do for the Washington Times Foundation and for the Washington Brief. Welcome to our audience. We have a very special program this month on the Korean Conundrum. Our moderator is Ambassador Joseph Tetrani, and he is a commentator on security issues, very excellent columnist for the Washington Times as well as many other journals. And he's a former associate director of the National Intelligence and special advisor to the director of National Intelligence. Prior to that, he was a senior official with the CIA. He was special envoy for negotiations with North Korea and did tremendous work and still is right at the center of things. Our panelist is Dr. Alexander Manzaroff. Dr. Manzaroff is an adjunct professor of security studies at the Edmund A. Walsh School for Foreign Service at Georgetown University in Washington. He is also an adjunct professor for Korean Studies at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University and also at the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. He is one of the few people in the U.S. who holds advanced degrees from the Moscow State University of International Relations, Kim Il-sung University in Pyongyang, North Korea, as well as Columbia University in New York, where he got his PhD. He plays a very key role in the intelligence and also the areas of understanding for Northeast Asia and America and all nations. Our special guest today is Mr. Robert Manning. Robert is a senior fellow with the Scowcroft Center for Strategic and Security and its Foresight, Strategy, and Risk Initiative at the Atlantic Council. He is author of several books, including The Global Innovation Sweepstakes, The Quest to Win the Future, also envisioning 2030. Can the U.S. keep its innovative edge? And the future of extended deterrence in Asia to 225 and other studies of global trends. He served as strategist at the DNI, National Counterproliferation Center, and previous to that, director of long-range energy and Regional Global Affairs at the U.S. National Intelligence Council's Strategic Futures Group. In addition, he has held numerous roles in planning and policy development for energy technologies and climate change issues. He's been prolific in publishing or editing essays, journal articles, and book chapters of nuclear weapons, Asian security issues, China, Korea, Japan, regional security architecture, and energy security. He is previously an advisor for policy and public diplomacy to the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs at the Department of State, as well as an advisor to the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Ambassador Tetrani, welcome. We're so happy to have you as our moderator. Please go ahead, Joe.
Thank you, Michael. It's always a pleasure being here with all of you, and today a special pleasure having our guest speaker, Robert Manning. Bob and I worked together at State Department a number of years ago, so we're very fortunate to have him here. Just a few comments before we open it up to Professor Manning to talk about some of the issues affecting all of us. Let me just say, this has been a very eventful month. We do live in interesting times. The Victory Day speech of Kim Jong-un on the 69th anniversary of the armistice of 27 July 1953 was a very impactful presentation, a very meaningful speech where he talked about North Korea being willing to use nuclear weapons in time of conflict with the United States and or the Republic of Korea. And certainly during this year, we've seen over 31 missile launches from North Korea, to include intercontinental ballistic missiles, intermediate range ballistic missiles, short range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, hypersonic missiles, submarine launch ballistic missiles, etc. And we're looking at the possibility, some would say the likelihood, I'm one of them who would say a likelihood of a seventh nuclear test coming out of North Korea. On the other side, we see the Yoon government administrations working very closely with the United States on enhancing joint military exercises. We're looking at the upcoming Ulchi Freedom Shield exercises at the end of August that will actually speak of hybrid, the potential for hybrid conflict and how we address that. And indeed, this is an interesting period. And I'll end on this note. We had a very interesting conversation between President Joe Biden and President of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping. And Taiwan was foremost on the list, but indeed, North Korea was discussed also. And as we speak, literally as we speak, we have House Speaker Nancy Pelosi in Taiwan. And given what China has said about the tension on the issue of Taiwan, this is something everyone is watching very closely. So this is just some of the many issues that we are experiencing during this month. And we're very fortunate to have Professor Manning with us today. Over to you, Bob.
Thank you very much. Well, I've got a lot to try to cover in a short time, but I guess just to follow up on what Joe was saying, I think we really have a new conundrum on the Korean Peninsula. The combination of COVID, Kim Jong-un's frantic pace of testing on missiles and further development of nuclear weapons, and then, of course, the Ukraine war has really upended the world system and left us kind of swimming in uncharted waters in a lot of ways. Let me start with what the North Koreans are up to, because I think that we tend to focus on quantity, how many tests, what type of weapons, but he's developing a full spectrum arsenal that is qualitatively new and different than what we've faced in the past. For example, going from solid fuel to solid fuel missiles reduces our warning time, for example. Cruise missiles, hypersonic missiles, he's trying to go after and beat our radars and sensors. And most troubling to me is the development of tactical nuclear weapons. And we saw recently indications that they might be deployed in frontline troops, according to Kim. So you put all that together, and I think there's a lot of new challenges. I think that what's also changed, we've had a tacit understanding that really over the last several years, that North Korea would not test nuclear weapons or ICBMs. And it was kind of a voluntary moratorium, and started under the Trump administration. The U.S. was sort of quietly not protesting too hard on their short and medium range missile tests. I think that in January this year, Kim gave a speech at a party congress where he talked about the need to consider restating all the temporarily suspended activities, which I took to mean ICBM tests and possible nuclear tests. And the other thing I think you need to think about is what is he up to? Because I think his intentions may be changing, and that's probably the most troubling at all. I think the tests are in part to enhance domestic legitimacy, in part because he's trying to build a second strike capability and a triad, and so that complicates what we have to think about in terms of deterrence. And when you add it all up, I think it raises questions about Oh, am I been muted?
Just for the last 2 seconds, Bob. Could you just
Oh,
repeat the
okay,
last sentence, please?
okay. Uh, I think what we've seen is that we've got a new situation. There's some good news as well. I think the Yoon administration in South Korea is much closely aligned with the United States and importantly with Japan, and this is going to open up more abilities. I mean, I think the net is we have new challenges to extended deterrence, and it's not Groundhog Day anymore. It's not this endless cycle of testing, reactions, more testing. I think we're in something new, and in my view, more dangerous. I think the Ukraine war has a lot of implications. Number one, in terms of how has it affected Kim Jong-un? I think, even before he watched Iraq and Libya and didn't trust American security assurances, but seeing Ukraine give up 2,000 nuclear weapons and having the multilateral security assurances prove to be absolutely hollow. If he had any inclination, I think he's much less inclined to entertain the idea of denuclearization. Diplomacy, at least for now, although there are factors that may change that. And I think also his goal is the same. I think his end game is he wants North Korea to be treated like Pakistan or Israel and accepted as nuclear weapon states and as a normal country. And that's why our sanctions have been so important in delegitimizing his activities. And I think that one of the challenges now is how do we update sanctions? Because the fact that he's been able to do all this testing and acquire all these materials and suggests to me that his cyber hacking and cryptocurrency may be even larger than we think. And I think it's going to be really important to go after their cyber activities and go after their overseas procurement network. That ought, in my view, ought to be a priority. I think the way it nets out, I think Kim is more distrustful. He feels he got burned in the summitry with Trump, in my view, because he overplayed his hand and thought he could manipulate Trump, and it didn't work. And in terms of how Ukraine has impacted Russia and China, that's another complication for the situation we're in. I think back to the six-party talks, and Russia and China were actually quite cooperative. In fact, even after the sixth nuclear test, when we imposed all these unprecedented sanctions, at least for the first year or so, China was pretty good about enforcing them. That has become more lax. And but in terms of their relationship, our relationship with Russia and China and how that impacts how they cooperate or don't cooperate, I think that could be a real problem. There's always been a complicated overlap of interests with China. In other words, they prefer a Korean Peninsula without nuclear weapons, but their priorities are no collapse, no war, and no nukes. Third, it's the exact opposite of U.S. priorities. And their concern is its overriding concern has been about stability, which is why they're continuing to provide fuel and food and medicines to North Korea. 90% of their trade, although that dropped off considerably when Kim went full porcupine after COVID and shut down the borders, and it's only recently begun to open up again. But if the one that I think that the test for me will be whether or not Kim does a seventh nuclear test and how China reactions. Given that we know all the preparations that have been made by North Korea for a test and the fact that they haven't tested, my bet was on the 4th of July. They love American holidays. And the fact that they haven't suggests to me that there's some pressure from China, which has enough problems both internally and with the United States that they don't really want to see this happen and have to deal with it. I could be wrong. They could test tomorrow, but I think that's one measure, I think, of evaluating China. How the notion that they will put pressure on North Korea, I think I've never bought that. I think if we had a robust diplomacy as we did with the six-party talks, and I can tell you both Joe and I were involved in those, and I was on 2 of the working groups, and there was literally everything North Korea could possibly want was on offer. Economic benefits, security benefits, normalization, and it fell apart really over transparency issues. They refused to declare their program. And if we don't know how many nuclear weapons they had, and obviously you can't denuclearize them. And number 2, about transparency, they wouldn't allow the IAEA to have full access challenge inspections, which are necessary for the credibility of monitoring and verification. So I think we've had that in the past, and where we're going now, I think is even make that even harder. I think let me turn to the good news, and that is the election of President Yoon in South Korea has opened up a lot of new things. Number one, there's been a change in public opinion towards China in South Korea over the last several years. Now you look at the polling data, it's 80-90% are anti-China. And so I think the Yoon administration is more concerned about strengthening the alliance with the United States. I noticed that China just the other day reiterated its 3 no's: no more THAAD deployments, no participation in the U.S. Missile Defense Network, and no trilateral military alliance. I have argued to the South Koreans that they should adopt their own 3 no's. No disrespect for South Korean sovereignty, no telling South Korea what its defense needs are, and no economic coercion in violation of China's WTO commitments. And I think we need to be less defensive and more assertive in throwing the Chinese rhetoric back in their face, because it's so hypocritical. And so I think what the Yoon administration opens up is we've seen steps towards a really important South Korea-Japan reconciliation based on the 2015 understandings. It's been a downhill slide on South-Japan relations for several years. And I think we're now heading back towards a reconciliation process and a strengthening of U.S., Korea, Japan trilateral cooperation. I think that's essential for security in Northeast Asia. And I think the Biden administration is very focused on building that. And I think that's beginning to take shape in terms of intelligence, defense cooperation. And I think that's going to be an important element, because the new situation we're in my view, poses a lot of new challenges to extended deterrence in Northeast Asia. The full spectrum of weapons has altered the military balance, and we have to figure out how to update and upgrade deterrence to counter that. And I think that's a process that is underway with all 3 countries, and but it's not going to be easy. I think a lot of inconsistency in U.S. policy has raised doubts in the minds of Korea and Japan. Of course, you see the polls in Korea, building support for nuclear weapons or return of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons, which of course would have no military significance other than kind of a political hand-holding in terms of our nuclear capabilities to deter North Korea. And I think we need to rethink, we've had these extended deterrence dialogues with Korea and Japan. I mean, maybe it's time to trilateralize them. Maybe it's time to upgrade them. Some people have proposed a planning arrangement like Europe, which I think is very problematic. But we need to be creative in figuring out steps to strengthen deterrence and U.S. reassurance. And I think so. I think I'd like to conclude shortly by just saying, this is a new situation. There are more uncertainties than I've seen in the last couple of decades, both in China's role, in Russia's role, in ROC-China relations, and in ROC-Japan relations. And so I think U.S. leadership is going to be very important in Northeast Asia. And I think the Biden administration, which has its share of flaws, I think has a very solid team on Northeast Asia and particularly on the Korean Peninsula. And so I'm optimistic in that sense. Although I have to say, it's hard for me to see at this moment North Korea re-engaging in denuclearization talks. My concern is that to pursue the goals I mentioned, becoming a Pakistan or an Israel, if you look at Kim's rhetoric, he's left open possibilities for diplomacy. But I think what diplomacy he's going to look for is not denuclearization, but arms control, and instead try to open up talks for, say, a nuclear freeze, cap and freeze. And the problem with that, of course, is the same problem we've had with denuclearization. If they don't tell us a complete listing of their nuclear program, we can't possibly know what we've frozen, number one. And if there's not total transparency in terms of IAEA access, we don't know that they're abiding by it. So I think I wouldn't be shocked if we saw it, if Kim pursued that course and the Biden administration at least explored it. But I think I have very low expectations that it would go anywhere for precisely those reasons. But I think we have to keep the door open to diplomacy. I think the North Koreans have a very complicated domestic situation, which I don't pretend to fully understand. But if you look over the last couple of years, the COVID closing, and they just seem to have enormous amounts of military and party meetings trying to sort things out, the shakeup. Their new foreign minister, Ms. Cho, of course, was a translator in the six-party talks, and as a leading American watcher, and that sparked some speculation that they might be leaning towards some kind of diplomatic opening. So I'll leave it there, and I hope I've been coherent and made sense. Thank you.
Wow. Bob, you've been very coherent, and you made great sense. You have your knowledge of what's happening on the Korean Peninsula is second to no one. And what a presentation. So let me just summarize a little and then go to Dr. Mansurov for his comments and questions to you, Bob. You talked about North Korea, the quality of the weapons, the nuclear, the missiles that are delivering these nuclear weapons, and the continuation of the nuclear weapons program per se. You talked about Ukraine and its impact on Kim Jong-un. Security assurances that meant nothing because of the invasion that took place, despite the fact that the Ukrainians gave up a significant number of nuclear weapons. You talked about China and the six-party talks, where there was movement, there was some progress there, but there was no transparency at the end, and that was the failure of it. You talked a lot about, correctly so, the Yoon government and working closely with the United States, and how important that is, and how China's reputation in South Korea has deteriorated significantly over the last year plus. And you spoke very eloquently about deterrence and the need to better understand deterrence and how we could better enhance deterrence so that we could move forward and get some momentum, obviously through diplomacy with North Korea. And talked about arms control negotiations, et cetera. That may be what Kim Jong-un is looking for. And how do we parlay that? How do we use it? So there's so much to unpack in your very comprehensive presentation. I'll look to Dr. Monsadov for his comments and some questions, and then we'll open it up to discussions. Dr. Monsadov.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Ambassador Detrani, and thank you, Bob, for your excellent, very illuminating presentation. Now, I make a few comments first, and then I'll ask you a question if you don't mind. The big picture, as the world enters the hegemonic transition period, I believe that it's becoming much more unstable, more uncertain, a much more threatening place to live. There is much less trust in the system, more hostility, more conflicts, more saber rattling, if you wish. And I cannot share the optimism of our distinguished guest speaker. I'm unfortunately a little bit, actually much more pessimistic and have very low expectations about the future for three reasons. And I'll talk very briefly about US-Russia relations, US-China relations, and then what's happening on the peninsula. On the US-Russia side, I mean, these relations are headed to a catastrophic rupture, in my opinion. I mean, we're in denial. As the US Senate just passed a resolution essentially telling the State Department of State to designate Russia as the state sponsoring international terrorism. In response, the Russian government threatened to basically break off diplomatic relations with the United States. No embassy, no trade, no strategic arms control negotiations, etc. And this is in addition to the fact that the United States is essentially directly engaged in a military confrontation against Russia and Ukraine via proxy and is waging a total hybrid war against Russia. I mean, yesterday, the new Russian naval doctrine was announced, which for the first time since the end of the Cold War designated the United States as the main enemy, again, for the first time, again, since 1991. Russia is going to counter the United States everywhere it can, both directly and by proxy, not just in Europe. And we saw a flare-up in Kosovo. Ambassador Chris Hill, our good friend now, has to deal with what's coming probably within a month, a major blow-up in Kosovo, but also in the Middle East, Latin America, Africa. On all these theaters, Russia is going to counter the United States. They just initiated a major naval buildup according to this naval doctrine. I mean, if you read it, not just between the lines, it's out there. The Russian government finally made up its mind what to do with the naval forces, and they decided to build 7 aircraft carrier groups. Whether this is just a pipeline dream or whether it's reality, at this point, that's the stated intent. And they're going to defend the interest from the Korean Straits all the way to Eastern Mediterranean, which they now designated as a strategic area. So that's on the Russia side. On China's side, the US-China relations face a severe stress, in my opinion, in the wake of Speaker Pelosi's visit. I mean, she landed in Taipei. What does it mean? It means that Xi Jinping lost face. And we know the Chinese don't like to lose face. They will not forget or forgive us for this. China is likely to accelerate its national unification campaign with Taiwan. They're likely to tighten the alliance with Russia. And the relations with the US, in my opinion, are never going to be the same. Basically now Xi Jinping will have to prove to his own people, let alone the international community, that he's got the balls. Because he's got a big omelet on his face now, and everybody doubts, the meaning of that 1010th Chinese warning, which we just heard. Now, I cannot even exclude the possibility of a military flare-up in the Taiwan Straits in the lead up to the Party Congress. I mean, everybody says, no, they need peace and quiet before the Party Congress this fall. But if you look back at 1969, the Damansky conflict, the Damansky military engagement with the former Soviet Union occurred actually a month before the Party Congress in China. So we may see an October surprise across the Taiwan Straits as a result of Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taipei. And finally, let me turn my attention to the Korean Peninsula, where I believe the division of Korea actually is getting deeper as a result of the fact that both Pyongyang and Seoul now chose opposing sides in the Russian-Ukrainian war and the China-Taiwan conflict. I mean, we know that Seoul decided to support Ukraine with volunteers sending its volunteers, although the government says they have nothing to do with that, but it's hard to convince the other parties that that's the case. So they're sending volunteers to the battlefront. They're sending arms, heavy arms, tanks, heavy artillery guns to Ukraine by way of Poland. That's an indirect transaction, but everybody understands what it's about. Humanitarian aid. I mean, Seoul joined all the anti-Russian sanctions, joined the asset freezes, and economic embargoes imposed on Russia. So the South Korean position is clear. Now, North Korea basically also decided to take sides. Not only Pyongyang recognized the independence and sovereignty of the newly declared republics, Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, but the head of Donetsk People's Republic is contemplating a visit to Pyongyang, where he's supposed to meet Kim Jong-un. They're talking about actually forging a mutual defense alliance between the Donetsk People's Republic and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK. And as to, DNR, Donetsk People's Republic, basically is not a UN member state. They couldn't care less about all these UN Security Council resolutions or sanctions. North Korea, as you know, is regarded as a rogue state in violation of all these sanctions and under a lot of sanctions. So they're talking about basically mutual assistance, whereby North Korea not only may dispatch its hardworking laborers to rebuild the economic enterprises, social infrastructure in Lugansk and Donetsk People's Republics, but even deploy, think about it, deploy either Korean People's Volunteers or Korean People's Army's units to the battlefields in Ukraine in exchange for energy, in exchange for grain, in exchange for machinery, high-tech, access to the US armaments, advanced weaponry deployed in the Ukrainian forces on the battlefield, let alone possibly access to some sensitive nuclear missile technologies. And this is a new ballgame. Speaking about the lessons learned, from denuclearization, failed denuclearization, I mean, I would argue that Pyongyang doesn't really need an extra excuse for its refusal to denuclearize. I mean, they made up their mind not just to go nuclear a long time ago, but not to give up their nuclear weapons a long time ago. And to say that now, okay, let's blame Putin for North Korean unwillingness to come to the negotiation table, that's a little bit ridiculous in my opinion. But the lesson which we need to learn, and it is really for the United States, and the lesson is that one of the official rationales for the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with its special military operation in Ukraine, was to prevent Ukraine from going nuclear. Whether you buy it or not, I mean, we all know what Zelensky said in Munich. We all know about the clandestine nuclear activities which were found in some Ukrainian facilities. And so what Russia decided to do was basically to launch that preventive war to stop Ukraine from reacquiring the nuclear weapons capabilities, among many other things. I mean, they had a lot of other rationales, excuses to do that, but this was one of the official rationales. So in my opinion, that's what the United States should have done to North Korea back in the early 90s or in 2003, instead of allowing Pyongyang basically to walk over all its red lines, allowing all these red lines to be diluted and then fade away. So just to conclude, I think we should stop being in denial about the future prospects for diplomacy on the peninsula, including the six-party talks. I mean, the Russian condition is clear. You return first $330 billion, which they believe the United States stole. We call it froze in their banks' accounts. Lift all the sanctions, which you imposed, you, the United States, as they say, and then we'll come back to any type of negotiations with the United States. And if you designate Moscow as a state sponsoring terrorism, then forget about it altogether, because there will be no diplomatic relations. The China, I mean, we just humiliated the president, who now has to prove that he's got balls. So it's unlikely to expect him to return to the negotiation table anytime soon. So we should stop being delusional about prospects for diplomacy for the time being. And in that sense, my question to Bob is related to your really intriguing proposal that South Korea needs to develop its own three no's for China to deal with the Chinese three no's. I mean, do you really believe that South Korea is in a position to issue a three no's ultimatum to Beijing, especially given what's going on these days?
So, Bob, do you want to answer that question and comment on anything else, Bob?
There's a lot to unpack here. One note, reports I've seen have confirmed that the North Koreans have agreed to send workers to rebuild Ukraine. It's some deal they've cut with Putin. I said that the three no's sort of half in jest. I think more broadly, the Chinese are running around giving lists to everybody. The list, this is their revenge for the 1922 Japan 22 demands. And I think that we've been too defensive. I wrote an article saying, I have 10 demands for China. Why don't we put them out to China? And I think we need to be thinking more in these terms, because with the Chinese, the hypocrisy of Xi Jinping making these demands using economic coercion that are totally incompatible with their WTO commitments, for example, that needs to be called out. His bogus claims in the South China Sea that are based on fantasies. It's kind of like that Trump never lost the election equivalent. And I think that we need to be more creative and more on offense. I focused my talks on the Korean Peninsula. I don't disagree that the international system is in deep trouble. I think the U.S. has a bad habit of gratuitous virtue signaling, and the idea of declaring him a terrorist state, it may be satisfying, but there are a lot of legal stipulations that go along if you do that. And you're right, that'll be the end of the relationship. And we took away MFN even after we boycotted all trade. It was totally gratuitous, right? And so we're not being very smart on China. We're in this death spiral that I see in the sense that we're this mutual demonization. That needs to somehow be unwound. And I'm not sure there's any adult supervision on either side. And so that's an issue. And I think for the US policy, in my view, we've never addressed the first question that US policy has to be based on. And that is, what do we consider China's legitimate interests? If you don't answer, because they're going to be a great power, they're going to do what great powers do. And it seems like every time they do that, we are in horror. So I think, how do you figure out how to live with a reemerged China? Xi Jinping's policies have outrageously been overreaching, and in my view, he's our best weapon, because he's alienated Europe, he's alienated a lot of Asia. and around the world, African president candidates are running for president against China. So I think it's been really counterproductive what he's done, and that it redounds, I think, to our benefit. But we don't have a stable relationship, and the challenge of how do we build a framework to manage competitive coexistence remains. And China's not going away. They got nuclear weapons. We got to figure out. You don't have to like them, but you got to figure out how to deal with them. And I don't think we've got wrapped our arms around that yet.
So Bob, let me follow up on that, on the China piece, based on what certainly Dr. Monsaroff has said, but indeed what you have said on that. Yeah, I mean, you spoke about coexistence. We have to coexist. There's no question about that. And I think that was part probably of the Xi Jinping and Joe Biden telephone call about those areas of cooperation. And our Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, has talked about that, areas of cooperation. And North Korea happens to be one of those areas where we have cooperated in the past. You cited the six-party talks. China was the host of the six-party talks. And you also said that China looks for, number one, stability on the Korean Peninsula, stability that doesn't affect China's core interests. And I might add, there are core interests in China, Bob, that we are very cognizant of, and China makes us very cognizant of it. And one of those core interests is Taiwan, which was a sine qua non of the Nixon visit, if you will, to Mao Zedong in 1972. And the acknowledgement that there's one China and Taiwan is part of China. So there are a lot of issues that sort of are interwoven in regards to the China equation. But on North Korea specifically, if stability, and I agree, and I think we all agree, stability is core, the key issue for China. They've seen 100 years of humiliation when China had no stability from within. They were weak internally, militarily, and so forth. So the party's in control, the party controls the gun, etc. So if stability is so important, the North Korean issue has to be resolved. That should be an issue, one of the key issues for China, resolving that issue. In addition to Taiwan, obviously, and some of the other issues there, but North Korea. So we now have Speaker Pelosi in Taiwan. Both you and Dr. Monsaroff have talked about that and mentioned that. And that has been an irritant, a significant irritant. And as Dr. Monsaroff said, an embarrassment for Xi Jinping, because China put some markers down about not having the visit. Well, the Speaker Pelosi had the visit, and that's happening as we speak. Had the visit, and it's going on. Certainly, Xi Jinping doesn't want. This is where I disagree with Dr. Monsaroff. I don't think he wants a lot of tension. He's got enough tension now with the economy, with the lockdowns and COVID, with the real estate market, with other issues there. And now looking for his third term, looking to be the president for life. I mean, do you want a flare up over Taiwan, et cetera? But that's got to be managed. But North Korea is sitting there, and we hear China saying, maybe because of the tension we have with the United States writ large on a multitude of issues, maybe this is not the time for us to help resolve the North Korean issue. It's not a time for us to try to get Kim Jong-un to come back to negotiations. So my question to you, Bob, is if stability is that important, which we will agree it is, wouldn't it be in China's interest to do something to get North Korea off this escalatory path they're on now, especially with the Yoon government? And I mentioned the upcoming joint exercises with Ulchi Freedom down the road at the end of this month, where we're talking about enhancing deterrence writ large and the possibility maybe even of stumbling into accidental conflict. Isn't it in China's interest to do something?
Well, yes, of course. But I mean, the problem is we have this mutual demonization has created a really poisoned public opinion in both countries. And that makes it very difficult for either Biden or China. You know, the Chinese have a saying, if you tied the knot, you have to untie the knot. And what I tell the Chinese is, your Politburo doesn't have to run for office every 2 years. So if you want Biden to work with you, you need to give him something to work with if you want to start stabilizing the relationship. And one point on Taiwan, you alluded to the Nixon visit. The U.S.-China the foundation of U.S.-China relations has been the 3 communiques and the Taiwan Relations Act. And you can argue that the Chinese have broke their end of the bargain, but I think we've also escalated in terms of over the last several years, our visits, our high-level contacts, our military relations with Taiwan. So the Chinese could be forgiven to think that we're hollowing out the 3 communiques. But to me, that's not an argument for confrontation. That's an argument for diplomacy. And maybe we need to revisit these things and renegotiate what are the red lines. But we're not doing that. And I think in terms of North Korea, there really has to be some movement in different directions. The Chinese want us to drop sanctions on North Korea as the price for cooperation. And we want China to put pressure on North Korea. And I don't think either of those things is very likely. So I think we should have a more active dialogue with China about, because they are uncomfortable with the situation, as you alluded to, and they do want stability. And I think we need to change the political atmosphere to create a situation where there's more political space for diplomacy and dialogue. We still don't have a strategic stability dialogue with China, even though there are mutual threats to both of our nuclear forces.
No, those are all excellent points. And I'm going to go look to Dr. Monsadoff. I'll make one comment, though, Bob. You mentioned the 3 communiques and the Taiwan Relations Act. And of course, the Taiwan Relations Act, which was congressionally mandated on the administration at that time, talked about a peaceful resolution, and we will provide defensive, military weaponry to Taiwan for defensive purposes. But again, a very strong request, admonition to China not to use force. To even a boycott or an embargo would be looked upon in a very negative way by the United States. And then President Reagan, with the 6 assurances, basically sort of saying, "Look, we're going to keep the supply of weaponry for defensive purposes to Taiwan, but it's an internal issue." So you're right. That's an area where there needs to be more dialogue, Bob, to really drill down on some of these issues. If there's any miscommunication, misunderstanding, that would be very, very unfortunate. But given all the work we've done with China, cooperating on a lot of issues to include counter-narcotics, counter-proliferation, and some other issues there, and that's all there. And climate is also, and pandemics are also on the table. Dr. Monsadoff, your comments, please. And let me just say, you made some very interesting comments initially, but further to Bob Manning's points on Taiwan and some of the other issues, what do you say about some of that?
Yeah, the question in my mind is about the incentive structure for North Koreans to come back to the negotiation table. And as Bob alluded, Ambassador Detrani alluded, we basically need to, do our part in terms of maybe alleviating some pressures, lifting some sanctions, and that might entice them to come back to the table, if not to strike a deal with us at the end of that process. And I'm just wondering, with a huge loophole in the international system being opened up right now, and that's the Donbass, with these two entities emerging, non-recognized by the international community, Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, through which North Korea can really get pretty much everything they need to satisfy the economic needs. I mean, energy, Russia is a glut of oil, gas, what have you, food, what have you. I mean, they have glut of grains, parallel imports. Through gray schemes, they can import whatever they need. Once North Korea forms these new relationships, which I alluded to earlier, it's not about only exchange of labor force, but really that's the new trade relationship, new investment relationships, which would be done off the radar screen, off the grid, if you wish, of the international financial system, international trade channels, legitimate international trade channels. Then what would be their incentives really to cooperate with us in terms of giving up something which they treasure, value, the nuclear missile capabilities, in exchange for something which they can get through these gray channels, outside the framework of the mainstream international financial and trading system, pretty much very low cost to themselves. That's a rhetorical kind of question. The real question I want to ask Bob, because he's a big thinker. I mean, he's a thought leader, he's a strategic thinker. And so the question on my mind for him is really whether the United States can take on two great powers at the same time. I mean, our relations with Russia are awful. I mean, they're worse than in the Cold War. Our relations with China are headed in the same direction. Can we, as the sole remaining superpower, really take on these two great powers at the same time without sacrificing Europe in the process, without losing the Middle East, without domestically kind of overburdening ourselves into overextension and self-implosion? What do you think?
Bob?
Well, I'm fairly critical of a lack of strategy. So you have Biden going in the Middle East and deep. We claim we're pivoting to Asia. That's where their future is. That's where our resources are. Then we go to the Middle East and deepen our commitment there. Biden has deepened our commitment and resources in Europe, and that's going to be true through the end of his administration and probably beyond. And so there's no strategy. If everything's a priority, nothing's a priority. And so I'm concerned about that. I'm also concerned about a lack of realism toward China. We keep focusing on all the things, day after day, what we don't like. What they're doing in Xinjiang is horrible. What they've done in Hong Kong, I love Hong Kong. I spent a lot of time there. They're destroying the Hong Kong. But the point is, those are internal Japanese areas. They're not international. What if the Chinese said we're going to break relations unless you stop massacring school children, and do gun control? I mean, it's not productive. We need to figure out what the priorities are. We need to figure out, what is the economic relationship going to look like as we strategically decouple, but we still going to have a robust trade relations. Our trade with China, even after all the sanctions and tariffs, is higher than it's ever been. It's over $650 billion a year. And we need a strategic dialogue. We have new threats to strategic stability from emerging technologies, AI, offensive cyber, hypersonic missiles, and counter space capabilities. These are mutual vulnerabilities. We can take out China's command and control, and they can take out ours. We need to have a dialogue to figure out where the guardrails are, where we can set limits on things like autonomous weapons and so on. We haven't done that, partly because the Chinese, there's the distrust on both sides has become so deep that I sort of struggle to figure out how can we unwind this. It's going to have to be very incremental, I think, one small step at a time. And I'm afraid it may take a Cuban Missile Crisis type tragedy or something like that to sober up both sides and recognize that we have to come to terms with each other.
So Bob, let me ask you this question then, Bob, on the dialogue. You and I were at State Department when we had a strategic dialogue with China. And certainly that continued afterwards, even in the Obama administration, a strategic and economic dialogue. Are you saying we do not have that dialogue? We need to enhance our communications?
I think communications are a problem. I mean, partly it's China. We have negotiated all these risk reduction measures, but if you're the head of ThinkPack, when you call up your Chinese counterpart, nobody picks up the phone because Xi Jinping controls everything, and they're afraid they don't know what they should say. So that kind of thing has been a problem. I think we need to have a more robust risk reduction. And that should be a centerpiece of a lot of our strategic dialogue in the near term. But I think, part of the past dialogues were sort of a bureaucratic laundry list, and I think it needs to be much more focused.
Bob, what if, would it be smarter on our part to tell the Chinese, we'll back off from Taiwan for a while if and when you back off from your close support for Russia? If you basically loosen up your ties with the Russians, stop backing whatever they're doing in Ukraine, we'll be willing to pay more respect to your core interest in Taiwan. That kind of quid pro quo, do you think, strategic terms, would it make more sense than just taking on two great powers at the same time?
I think we need to rethink a lot of this. I'm not sure that transaction would work. Look, as far as I'm concerned, no matter what happens in Ukraine, Putin has already lost. He has mortgaged Russia's future. Tens and tens of thousands of younger generation in an aging society have left, particularly high-tech skills. We canceled Russia's central bank. That scared the heck out of the Chinese. They have $3 trillion in dollar and euro assets. And the technology sanctions, they're not going to be able to rebuild their military. They're not going to get spare parts for their oil industry. Well, I think that they're going to be really set back as a modern nation, no matter what happens.
Bob, I just want to interject here because I know we're coming to the hour, and we want to end on time for our listeners. Very excellent points. I do want to make one point to something Dr. Mansourov said about North Korea and its relationship with now Donetsk and so forth. What do they want? I think many of us, Alexander, and I think you know this so well, have worked with the North Koreans over the years. I think Kim Jong-un wants North Korea to be a normal, normal nation state. I don't think Kim Jong-un wants North Korea to be a pariah state, heavily sanctioned state, and I think opening up and having a normal relationship with the United States, the Republic of Korea, would fit in that mode. And I think that's what he was looking at with the Trump summits in Singapore, and even meeting with Moon Jae-in prior to that. And unfortunately, the Hanoi didn't go that well. So I think I'll take the prerogative as a moderator here. I think North Korea was, and I think is still looking to get out of the penalty box and be viewed as a normal nation state, a non-sanctioned state with normal relations. But I think as Bob Manning indicated a few minutes ago, they're looking at it on their terms, like a Pakistan, to be accepted as a nuclear weapon state. And that's the rub. And we see this even in New York with the Non-Proliferation Treaty conference going on, and the comments from the Secretary General of the Atomic Energy Agency, International Atomic Energy Agency. We're concerned about nuclear proliferation, and that's the big issue now. And that's why North Korea will not be accepted as a nuclear weapon state. It will move in a different trend line. So there's a lot to unpack on all these issues here. But I must say the discussion, Dr. Manning, is just fantastic. Dr. Mansourov, thank you for your comments and your questions. And over to you, Michael, for closing statements.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Detrani. As always, your moderation is so clear and so wonderful. I want to thank Mr. Robert Manning of the Scowcroft Institute for all you have done today to help our listeners understand what a critical point of inflection we're at with Russia and China and North Korea. And thank you to Dr. Manzaroff. Always, your wisdom and understanding comes through and gives us insights very deep into the thinking of the North and also of Russia and China. I want to thank the Washington Times for its support. Mr. Chris Dolan, the president, has given tremendous support to this. Our sponsor, Universal Peace Federation, Dr. Thomas Walsh is the chairman, and to many of our other supporters and friends. We are learning so much every time. This program is now available at washingtonbrief.org. You simply go to that link. You don't have to put the www or anything else. In your browser, put washingtonbrief.org, and you'll see Mr. Manning and Joe in this program. And if you go to past episodes, you will find all the past programming we've had with people like Ambassador Harry Harris, Ambassador Stevens, or Senator Todd Young, and many experts in this area. We're very, very happy today to present this program to you. Bob will be inviting you back for sure very soon. And thank you again, Ambassador Detrani, for your leadership.
Thank you, Michael.
We really seek peace in Northeast Asia that is really a long-lasting and cooperative peace. We thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful week.